Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
And we're apart yet again after spending a lot of time together. And the people might think, well, absence makes the heart grow fonder, but they would be mistaken. That's not what happens, because I have to ask the usual question, which I know you will answer and irritate the hell right out of me. But here we are. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
Well, it's new, but it's not exciting.
I always ask for too much, I know.
There are things that people just repeat, and they get repeated so much they catch on. I've noticed this in the past. They typically have to do with economic fallacies. People just repeat the same words, and other people start to accept this as truth. And recently, I've been noticing repeated again and again this idea that the rich can somehow avoid taxes by using loans to borrow against their assets. You can tell that this is nonsense because when you drill down and ask the details of how this actually works, they start hand-waving. Someone will say something like, well, the rich have lots of assets and can borrow against those assets. And of course, when you take a loan from a bank, the money you receive, the loan is not taxable. And so the claim is, well, this is just what the rich do. They have assets that enable them to borrow. They borrow this money and the money's not taxed and they're not paying taxes.
Missing the entire thing completely.
That completely ignores the fact that when you take a loan, you then have to make payments on that loan, both interest and principal. And where does the money come from to make those payments? It comes from your income, which is taxed. In fact, if anything, if you do this, you end up paying more taxes because you're paying tax on the income necessary to repay the loan, plus you're paying tax on the income necessary to pay the interest on the loan. But if you say this, people will come back with this thing of, well, yeah, but the rich can borrow so much that they can actually take out additional loans that they then use to pay for the original loans. I'm a rich guy, I borrow $10 million. When it comes time to make payments on this loan, I take out another loan, and with the proceeds from that second loan, I make payments on the first loan, thereby avoiding taxes. Except that just pushes the whole business down one level, because that second loan requires interest and principal payments, which come from, ultimately, your income. So if anything, you've actually made the whole situation worse, because now, not only are you having to pay back the loan from taxable income, but you have to pay the interest on now 2 loans from taxable income. But then if you push people this far, some of them will say, yeah, but under these esoteric tax laws, it's possible for the rich person to borrow against his assets, let's say it's stock, live off of the loan, and then pass the whole thing, loan and stock, on to the heirs. The heir then sells the stock to pay back the loan, and under this esoteric stepped-up in basis law, the heir does not have to pay tax on the sale of the stock. And so once again, we've found this system by which the rich can avoid taxes. And yet, if you drill down, it doesn't work that way either. Because if I'm a rich person and I have a bunch of stock and I use this stock as collateral to borrow money, and I now live off of this money, I die and I leave the stock to my heirs, the stock doesn't go directly to my heirs, it's first sold off to pay back the loan. And when it's sold off, it's taxed. And the heirs receive whatever's left over after the loan is paid and the taxes are paid on the stock that's sold off to pay the loan. And so we're back at this situation of this is not a scheme by which the rich can avoid taxes, despite the fact that it appears to be repeated ad nauseum all over the internet. Now, there are ways that the rich can mitigate their taxes, but this isn't one of them.
I remember back in the Harrigan youth, you'd get a credit card and you'd run up charges. And before you know it, it's a little difficult to pay off. And you could take out another credit card and pay off the first credit card with the next credit card. I had friends that had 6, 8 credit cards and they were pulling this game of roulette. You know, sooner or later, you got to pay the piper.
Right. It's musical chairs. The music's going to stop. And when it does, you got to pay the tax man. Oh, and by the way, this business about borrowing against your assets, this is not something only the rich do. The middle class do it all over the place. We call it mortgages. That's exactly what a mortgage is.
That's right. And that's why you have to have a certain down payment. The mortgage broker wants to make sure that you are motivated to pay off the loan. I've got something a lot more ridiculous. Oberlin College. There was an incident there some time ago that a lot of people might have forgotten. 3 young black students from Oberlin showed up into the Gibson's Bakery, which is a local family business. And this is an important part. Gibson's had a deal with the university that they provided the breakfast at Oberlin College. These 3 kids go in, and one uses a fake ID to purchase alcohol and then shoplifts another bottle of wine and runs out the door. At which point, the guy who owned the store took offense and ran after him, and they get all 3 of these kids together. The police come, they arrest them, and then Oberlin College goes batshit crazy. They decided that there's no way that this wasn't racism. You and I both know what a bunch of nonsensical professor types would do if they didn't have to follow any rules. Well, on the universities themselves, they don't have to follow any rules. They can say whatever crazy nonsense they want, and they're backed up almost completely by every student and every other professor. Here, they went a little too far. Apparently, they picked a fight with the wrong people. The university, in its official capacity, started sending students down there to protest, not realizing that that was not 1, but 1,000,000 steps too far. And not only that, the university canceled its contract with them to provide all the breakfasts because they're all racist. This got into a court of law, and the court cares about the merits of the case. A jury gave them a $50 million judgment.
Oh my God, $50 million?
A trial jury awarded Gibson's Bakery $11.1 million in compensatory damages, $33.2 million in punitive damages, and $6.3 million in attorney's fees. Because when a man's down, you might as well just keep right on kicking. But the interesting thing is that $33.2 million in punitive damages. The jury understood clearly that they were looking at a bad actor. The college had overstepped all kinds of bounds. So the college, in what could only be not surprising, appealed the verdict and got slapped down so hard that all of the original charges hold. This would warm the cockles of my heart if I had a heart. I hope that the long-term pain on the college is such that they will start hiring rational human beings.
But look at what a great lesson the courts have provided to the Oberlin students, that there are consequences to one's actions.
That's right. And I hope a lot of other colleges look at this and say, all right, we've got the crazy faculty that we've got, but maybe we tell them not to send people out to picket businesses in town.
Where was Oberlin's lawyer in all of this?
Losing. The Wall Street Journal has the story. I'm going to leave it in the show notes. If you don't have a subscription, you may not be able to see it, but you'll find it in lots of other places. That was not the foolishness of the week.
Oh, that was right up there.
There's a town in Oklahoma called Tallahassee. This was a thriving all-black town. It was, as the story goes, ravaged by governmental policies that divested it and other black communities. I don't know what that means, actually. Let me just read you the money paragraph. The once thriving all-black town of Tallahassee was ravaged by government policies that divested it and other black communities, said Mayor Keisha Curran, and she says the city is owed reparations to get back on its feet. So what we've got here is a town in which no one lives. And in order to make right our racially charged past, what we need to do is give some money to somebody to rebuild an entire town.
Hang on,
Now,
I missed something. What do you mean nobody lives?
Nobody lives there. It's an empty town.
So when you said devastated and ravaged, that's exactly, there's nobody there.
No, everybody moved away. And apparently white America is on the hook to rebuild this town. I mean, reparations always sounded foolish enough to me, right on the merits of the first kind, when we had to pay it to individual people. When we have to pay it to rebuild a town that everybody has decided not to live in.
Right, it's not a town, yeah?
But I guess when that sweet, sweet government money is a possibility, you'll say and do anything to get it. And I think we're probably going to see a lot more of things like this, which is a collective vision of guilt and punishment.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion.
You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits. If you'd like to schedule us to come speak at your event, be it corporate or educational, or have James officiate at your wedding, send us an email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Today we're recording from Mount Hebron High School in Ellicott City, Maryland. In front of us are 150 students who comprise the largest and objectively most successful economics program in Maryland, likely in the country, possibly in the world. Under the direction of their teacher, Van Prime, the economics students at Mount Hebron participated in the National Economics Challenge, a competition among 10,000 high schools across the country. Mr. Prime's students have won the national championship 6 times, placed as national finalists 9 times, and won the Maryland State Championship 16 times. Not satisfied with dominating in the United States, the students have also participated in the International Economics Olympiad, where they won first place in the world. If you'd like to learn more about Van Prime's astounding students, look in the show notes for links to their media appearances. The students have submitted to us ahead of time some questions that they're interested in discussing, so we've picked some of the more interesting ones, and I have in front of me a 10-page document of over 120 questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we picked some of the more interesting ones and also ones that touch on topics that several students have mentioned. And we've asked the students to come up and ask their question. We'll respond, and feel free to stay here if you have any follow-up questions that we can address, and treat this more like a conversation than a presentation.
What kind of economic impacts has the increasing polarity between the Democratic and Republican parties in the U.S. created?
I'll turn this into a debt question if you don't mind. From our perspective, the difference between Democrats and Republicans is quite small. They all behave in the same way. They just have different goals. Democrats tend to spend on domestic social things. Republicans tend to spend on military things. No matter how you look at it, they're all still spending. And they always spend more than they have. They both do that. It doesn't matter which party is in power in the White House. It doesn't matter which party is in power in Congress. The same answers come. Now, the spending is a little different. What they spend on. The amounts, almost always the same.
We've gotten to a point where we treat our politics like sports. When I say we, I mean the voters. And I think the voters have the blame here. We could point to politicians and say they're evil or whatever it is. Politicians are not unlike the media. The media will give us what we want. If you want to see bad news, salacious things, that's what the media will give you. Because why? The media is selling advertising, and if that's what you watch, that's how they can sell advertising. So the media gives us what we want. So do politicians. They give us what we want. And we've gotten to a point, the voters, where we've come to treat our parties like sports teams. And, go team, whatever it is. And it doesn't matter whether the team is doing something good or bad. In fact, there was a fascinating social experiment. You could find it on YouTube. You may know the one I'm talking about, where somebody was on a college campus and he stopped people and he said, look, I think it was George Bush and Obama at the time. Here's a bunch of George Bush's policies. What do you think about this? And he'd ask Democrats and they'd say, oh, no, that's horrible. All these policies are bad. And then he'd say, okay, well, here's Obama's policies. And he'd list them out. And what do you think about those? Oh, yeah, those are excellent policies. We should definitely do that. And then he'd stop Republicans. And he'd ask the same question. And what he had done was to reverse the policies. So when he said, here are George Bush's policies, it wasn't George Bush's policies, it was Obama's. And when he said, here's Obama's policies, it wasn't Obama's policies, it was George Bush's. And what happened was the people were saying these are great policies or these are horrible policies, not because of the policies, but because of the name. The people said, yeah, I'm a Democrat, he's a Democrat, those are great policies. Or I'm a Republican, he's a Democrat, these are bad policies. And we've come to do this. And so what do politicians do? They respond to that because they're in the business of winning elections. And if they perceive that you think of them as teams, then they're going to do whatever it takes to tap into that psyche of yours and say, go team. And so they give us the kind of economic policies that excite us, not necessarily that are good. They benefit from pitting us against each other. And you'll see it, I won't name politicians, but you can pick some who say things like, we're going through this period of inflation right now. It's because of the greedy corporations. And they'll talk about grocery stores raising their food prices. What they're trying to do is to get us fighting each other. That the problem is this other guy over here. Because if you can get mad about the opposing political party, you're more likely to come out and vote when I run again. What this also does, if I can get you mad at the other party or get you mad at the corporations or the billionaires or whatever, it takes your attention away from this root of the problem. And the root of the problem is the politician himself. The reason we're experiencing this inflation that we're experiencing is because the Federal Reserve is printing money. The Federal Reserve is printing money to finance federal government spending, which needs to be financed because we've had multi-trillion-dollar deficits. The root of the inflation problem is the politicians themselves. They don't want you to pay attention to that. So to the extent they can get you mad at each other, that's great news for them on two counts. One, you come out to vote more, and two, you don't pay attention to me, which is where the problem actually lies.
And it's clear it's working because you can turn on any of those talking heads TV shows, and what do you see? People screaming at each other over nothing. They all have talking points, and they never answer an honest question. They're programmed to behave in this way because they know it works. And I identify the problem not with politicians at all, but with voters. I think it's our fault. And every time we say things like, there ought to be a law, and we say that a lot, take a step back and say, okay, I understand that every law brings with it the death penalty. Now, it's not written that way, but take, for example, Eric Garner in New York City. He was selling single cigarettes out of a pack. That's illegal. The police jumped on him. They brought him to the ground. They strangled him as they tried to get him into handcuffs. He's a very big man. And they killed him over selling loose cigarettes. That's the end result of every law if you don't comply. And when you start looking at that sort of governmental power that you will never have, you have to start asking questions about the laws they pass. And we don't. We get the politics we deserve. If we deserved better, we would have to act better. And the American founders knew that. And they tried to design a government which would filter out the worst of our behaviors through institutional governance. It worked for a while, but even at the time it was working well. I mean, we still had slavery, so you can't point back to a time like that and say, well, clearly everything was better then. It wasn't. And it just kind of dissipated over time. We were told that the institutions would battle each other. And what we never came to terms with was that's not going to happen once the parties realized they can collude. And once they started colluding, all bets were off. The separation of powers came to nothing when the two parties said, you know what we should do? We should make sure nobody else can do this. They decided to have a corporation control which candidates got to debate on a stage for the presidency. It's not terribly surprising that only Republicans and Democrats are allowed to be on the stage. Other parties are fringe parties, and they're going to remain fringe parties until they get on that stage. And what happens is the Democrats and the Republicans have banned competition. They only compete with each other, and the outcomes we get from each of them are roughly the same.
How many of you think that the party system is a governmental construct? Some of you, yeah. I know many adults, in fact, the majority of adults I ask this question to say, oh yeah, well, it's written in the Constitution that we're a two-party system. Right. Parties aren't mentioned in the Constitution at all. The political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are corporations. They're nonprofit corporations, but they're corporations. They were founded as associations of people, just like any other nonprofit corporation is founded. They control who is allowed onto the presidential debate stage, the televised thing. If you can't get on that stage, you're not going to get any serious traction as a candidate. There are two corporations that are controlling who gets on national television as a candidate. Now, if those two corporations were in any industry other than politics, the Supreme Court would have come down on them as a ton of bricks, that this is a clear antitrust violation. They're colluding. And yet this case has come before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has backed off and said, no, we're not going to touch this.
And the funny thing here is that those two corporations have set a 15% threshold. So you have to get in national polling with polls that are widely recognized as being good, you have to get 15%. And if you don't, you can't get on the stage. Now, sooner or later, somebody's going to get the 15%.
And they're going to up it to 20.
And they're going to up it to 20. That's exactly right.
With a modern-day economy and a rapidly rising inflation, do you believe that the government should take further action or step back and let the invisible hand handle a current situation?
Let me give you an answer both ways. And you'll find this theme running through our book, Cooperation and Coercion. An unfettered economy is bad, as is a lockdown economy. That is, the government has an important role to play. And if it strays from that important role in either direction, you get bad outcomes. And that important role, I believe, is one of helping to define the rules of the game and enforcing the rules of the game. Or in other words, protecting property rights. And that's it. Anything beyond that, which is where governments tend to err, is bad. But anything less than that is bad as well. So people say things like, well, if you believe in free markets, go live in Somalia. Well, Somalia's got the same problem, only it's in the other extreme of not enough government defining property rights. And be careful here, because when people talk about defining property rights, we don't simply mean a government that protects my property, my money, my house, whatever. It includes things like a government that protects my life, a government that prevents corporations from polluting the air and the water. Those are all violations of property rights as well. So a government that protects property rights but otherwise leaves people alone seems to hit that sweet spot of enough but not too much.
There are all kinds of problems around the edges with all of that, and yet there's no way to answer them all that well. What about the rights of workers? What about what we would consider to be more basic human rights? And I think the government probably has a pretty solid role to play there as well. When you hear us talking about markets, I think you would always have to say markets broadly construed. As Ann says, it's not just this thing right now. It's not your house. It's not your car. It is those things, but those are not sufficient. It's a lot more too.
With oil and natural gas prices rising, will the economy naturally move towards sustainable energy sources, or will the government need to create incentives or enact laws to move the economy?
Yeah, see, this is interesting because it refers to the previous question, which is the proper role of government. If you have a government that is protecting property rights, and that's all, then the government is not, for example, subsidizing big oil, nor is it allowing energy producers to pollute the environment. And if you're in a situation like that, the market will figure out what the right energy source is. Is it fossil? Is it renewable? Is it some combination? And the answer is not entirely clear, because we can say all these wonderful things about solar, for example, or wind, but there are environmental problems there as well that we aren't fully aware of because we aren't doing those things on a massive scale like we're doing fossil. If we did those things on a massive scale, people would be complaining about the environmental consequences there. So there's some right balance. But one of the things I want to point to here, I want to call out environmentalists particularly. Environmentalists who rightly say things like, well, look, we've got all this greenhouse gases caused by fossil fuels. We need to do something. Part of the reason that we have the greenhouse gas problem is because of environmentalists. 40 years ago, when we were developing nuclear energy, environmentalists stopped it. We haven't had a nuclear plant built in this country for decades. And a small fraction of our power comes from nuclear. In comparison, France gets something like 70% of its power from nuclear. Nuclear has zero greenhouse emissions. If the environmentalists hadn't stopped nuclear back in the 1970s, we would be today producing far, far less greenhouse gases than we are. It wouldn't be zero, but it'd be far less. Now, you can say, and rightly so, but there are environmental consequences with nuclear. What if you have a meltdown? What if you have radiation release? Yeah, of course there's that. But thinking like economists, that's the wrong question. The right question isn't what power source comes with no costs. The right question is, what power source comes with less costs than the one we have now? And yes, you have problems. They're much less now today because of advanced technology, but you have problems with the radiation, these sorts of things, with nuclear. But you don't have problems with oil spills like you do with petroleum. And if you compare the two of the environmental damage that has been done to the planet to date, far more damage has been done because of fossil fuels than ever was done by nuclear. And so I blame in part the environmentalists for putting us where we are now. What's the right answer here? The right answer here is, I don't know. And if I as an economist don't know, I guarantee you the politicians don't know. Leave it to the market, provided that whatever decisions people make out there, they have to pay the consequences. They can't foist the consequences of their decisions on someone else. That's protecting property rights.
And I can go a bit further than this. Anthony lives in western Pennsylvania, where I think there are probably, 6 sunny days a year?
Yeah.
It rains every day, and then the days it doesn't rain, it snows. Solar power is never going to work there. I live in Tucson, Arizona. We get 350 sunny days a year. Of course solar power is going to work there. And you start to realize that there are geographical differences that keep you from making blanket statements. Now, how do I know that up till right now, solar power, even in Tucson, is not particularly cost effective? I look out and not every house has panels. If it got to the point where you could recoup your investment in a pretty short period of time, more people would put the solar arrays on their roofs. I'm thinking about doing it right now because the return on investment has gone from 8 to 10 years to 7 to 10 years. And you start to realize that, all right, the cost is coming down, and I'm going to take every subsidy I can get because I'm not stupid. If I were in charge, I would say don't give subsidies. But if I'm purchasing something, yay, subsidies. The minute it becomes cost effective, that's when people start signing up. So you kind of have to predict it a little bit before. And I think we're seeing the signs now in sunny places. I think you'll never see the signs in western Pennsylvania. These are the answers that markets provide.
Do you think the government putting incentives for certain companies is too much? Like what the government putting themselves in the actual economy? Is it too much, or do you think it's fine?
In my world, there would never be any such thing as a government subsidy for any company. For any company at all, actually. The more I think about it, I think I'm willing to be that forceful in my answer. You might have a different one.
I generally tend to believe that. Here's the problem. Politicians don't know what the right answer is. And you could say, well, the right answer is solar, so we should subsidize solar. How do you know the right answer is solar? They don't know. In fact, the market doesn't know. We're the same flawed human beings here in the marketplace as the politicians. But there's a big difference between the flawed human beings in the marketplace and the flawed human beings in politics. And the difference is, when I leave you to make decisions for yourself in the marketplace, if you make a bad decision, you're the one who pays the price for that. If a politician makes a bad decision, the politician doesn't pay the price for that, we do.
And more often than not, we double down on the problem.
Right. So often, if the politician makes a decision and it turns out to be the wrong decision, he'll claim, well, the problem is we didn't do enough of it.
Imagine how bad it would have been
if we hadn't
done this.
And so what that means is when you've got flawed human beings across the board, if some of the flawed human beings have to live with the consequences of their decisions, those particular human beings have tremendous incentive to identify errors and correct them as quickly as possible. The human beings who don't have to live with the bad consequences of their decisions don't have that same incentive. Now, can I hope that the politicians really care about me and really care about making good decisions? Sure, I can hope that, and certainly there are politicians like that. But even when you find a politician who really does care about people and really does want to do the right thing and really make the good decision, that incentive still doesn't come close to the incentive of what happens when you lose your house because you made a bad decision.
I could write a constitutional amendment that would solve our debt problem. And it would solve it 100% of the time. All it would have to say is Congress must submit a balanced budget. And if they don't, they all go to prison. If the people, us, if we wanted to solve our budgetary problem, we would ram that amendment through tomorrow. But we don't. Nobody ever even thinks about it. When we bring it up, people say, you guys are crazy. But we're not crazy, actually. That's the way to solve the problem. But what do people want instead of solving the problem? They want lots of free stuff from the government. And that's why this amendment will never, ever work, because you can't get them around the free stuff argument.
Right. I can say I want a balanced budget. But if a politician comes along and says, well, okay, how about not a balanced budget in exchange for free college? Oh, all right, that's fine. So I'll vote for the guy. And then he says to James, how about not a balanced budget in exchange for increasing your retirement benefits? And James says, oh, okay, I'll vote for that.
I especially like the interest deduction I get on my mortgage.
Right. Now take that phenomenon and multiply it by 535 politicians, and all of a sudden you have everybody in the country whose number 2 priority is balancing the budget, but everyone in the country has a number 1 priority that is, okay, but don't balance the budget in exchange for this one thing that I want.
On the topic of internalized costs and internal energy, what's your opinion of like a climate tax to internalize the cost of emissions for private individuals?
The question was about a carbon tax. With fossil fuel, you have this problem that I can run my lawnmower engine and it emits pollution that imposes a cost on you. Now, I've said that the proper role of government in society is protecting people's property rights, and I've just violated your property rights by polluting the air that you breathe. So there's a good and proper role for government here in mitigating that pollution. Now, how's the best way to go about doing that? I don't know. Carbon tax is one approach. It's not a perfect approach, but it's one approach. There are other approaches we might think of. But whatever the best approach is to achieve that end of preventing people from harming each other is the right answer.
So in other countries, like this push towards public transportation. So with rising like gas prices, do you think like people are going to start taking public transportation?
I think there's a 2-part answer to that question. Inside major cities, public transportation seems to work reasonably well. Is it perfect? No, not by a long shot. But I live in a city of about 500,000. There are buses that more or less blanket the city. And oddly, when I look at them as they make their runs through the city, they're almost always empty. So, okay, there's something going on locally. And locally is where you can make the case that these are going to work best. I lived in Boston for a while. I can't imagine that town without the MBTA. It works well. It's a little expensive for my taste, but so are cars. When you get this argument about Europe, though, it's functionally a different argument, because when you look at Europe, people are usually talking about going from one major city to another. Anybody who's been to Europe has probably done this. I always use trains. They tend to run pretty close to on time, and they cost very little. They work there because all the major cities are close together. That's exactly why they'll never work here. You can't take a train from Boston to Los Angeles without wasting your time. Airplane traffic, much cheaper. This is what we have decided works here. And of course, that's what we've decided. Our major cities are far flung. They're far apart. I'm going to go to the airport as soon as I'm done here and fly home to Tucson. If I had to take a train or a bus, I would have to waste the better part of the next 3 days. I'm not willing to do that. And when you look at it, no one else is either. So you get this twofold kind of answer. Within the cities, it makes a lot more sense. And when you look at from town to town, it makes almost no sense at all. A lot of people on the American left want to hold up Europe as the standard. And I get that. It's a good standard. But our geography doesn't lend itself to the same sorts of answers.
Do you know the story of the Sunset Limited?
Oh, for crying out loud.
It's an Amtrak line. It was inaugurated in the 1970s. The Sunset Limited runs from Los Angeles to New Orleans. For a while, it went on to Tampa, but then I think they shut that section down. But today, it still runs Los Angeles to New Orleans. Been running since the 1970s. Has never turned a profit. Not once. From the time I was in kindergarten, the Sunset Limited has never turned a profit. And yet it persists. It keeps on running. In fact, not only has it not turned a profit, the Sunset Limited loses so much money. Amtrak would actually save money if it shut down the Sunset Limited and handed out free airline tickets to its former passengers and said, fly from Los Angeles to New Orleans. It's actually cheaper for Amtrak to hand out free airline tickets than it is to keep running the Sunset Limited. Now, how is it that the Sunset Limited still runs despite these massive losses? It still runs because the Sunset Limited runs through a tremendous number of congressional districts, throwing off jobs in every one of them. And so all of a sudden, you've got a situation where a bunch of congressional representatives have an incentive to keep voting for the Sunset Limited, even though it's a massive loser. It achieves what each individual politician wants, which is to get reelected because there's a bunch of jobs in my district. And this is the sort of problem that arises when you attempt to do public transportation over massive distances like that. Doing public transportation on a shorter distance within a city is fraught with enough problems. But at least there, the taxpayers are much closer to the politicians and are able to hold them accountable. I live in Pennsylvania. I can't hold Arizona politicians accountable for anything. And yet, those Arizona politicians keep voting for the Sunset Limited, which comes out of my pocket.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
But until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend.
Well, that's an interesting twist. Be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it.
Being nice to people who deserve it is easy.
That's easy, right?
Being nice to somebody who doesn't deserve it is really hard. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.